good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this big wild world. This is Despina and Simona, and this is our podcast, Tell Muses. It is a podcast from storytellers, by storytellers, with storytellers, for storytellers. And today we have with us the wonderful, the brilliant, I will just applaud myself because I have been so looking forward to this, Jim Brule. So thank you so much for being here, Jim. Thank you. It's lovely having you here.
It's a delight to be here.
The way we normally start this is by asking our guest if you could tell to people who don't know you, who is Jim Brule?
Well, I'm a storyteller, so that tells you it would be a very long story if I were to answer that question. The thing that feeds me now is to be a storyteller of what I call transformational stories. So these are stories that are designed not to teach a lesson, although there's always lessons, and not to entertain per se, although it's a good thing to be entertained, but stories that have as my goal allowing people the opportunity to grow and change, especially spiritually, but not in any one particular religion or tradition, just inside. And so I like to tell stories that have moments of ambiguity, that have empty spaces, that have contradictions, that aren't easily digested, although like a good meal, there's a lot of substance to them. You just want time to digest afterwards. And I've been doing that now in a serious way for about 15 years, but longer than that, really. And the last thing I'll say is where that has led me to in particular, besides teaching and doing workshops and all, is to be working with people at the end of life. And that's where I spend a lot of time, either with people who are at the end of their lives or with people who are at the end of their lives. So caretakers, family members, and even some people who say, maybe it's time I start thinking about this. And so we do that work with stories. And sometimes it's their stories, sometimes it's a traditional folktale that I tell, but that's where I spend a lot of my time.
Thank you, Jim. And one thing that I always like to ask is, how did you get into storytelling? How did you start telling stories? What is your relationship with stories?
Well, again, now there's a very long story, but I'll tell you two versions of it, because a good story always has more than one version. When I was a teenager in college, I was hired to work at a mountain climbing camp for boys. And I was hired to be their arts and crafts director. I spent the first summer there, and the director of the camp came to me and he said, "Jim, we love having you on the staff. You work so well with people. You really don't know arts and crafts at all, do you?" And I said, "No." I said, "Well, we'd like to keep you on, but how about if you were our storyteller?" And so that my first job really was as a storyteller. So that's one version of the story. Another is I've had a number of careers that most people wouldn't think of as being storytelling. For 10 years, I was a family therapist. Well, that's all about learning how to listen to somebody else's story and helping them tell it a different way. And then I was in computer science and artificial intelligence back in the 1980s when it was still early. And my job there was to understand how people thought and to communicate that to people who are going to write computer programs. So I was a storyteller there too. And my last commercial career I was working in the healthcare industry as a regulatory expert, helping doctors understand the thousands of pages of regulations that the government was publishing on how they should be doing healthcare. And the only way to do that was with stories. So stories have been a thread through everything I've done, but I've been doing this as my main focus, as I said, for about 15 years. And and got training to do this kind of work. So it's a big part of my life.
So diverse, so many things you've done, so many different things with one common denominator,
That's right.
nevertheless. So, Jim, you're also a writer, is that right? I mean, I have
Yes.
one of your books, the one you wrote with Rebecca Lemaire. Would you like to
Hmm.
tell us about that or anything else?
Sure. So Rebecca Lemire and I are wonderful colleagues and friends who've never met in person, but we started working together early into the pandemic. And the pandemic was in many ways a gift because it allowed people to meet from a greater distance. And she and I shared this interest in end of life and stories related to that. And so for really almost a couple of years, we taught a series of 6 courses. I'm sorry, 4 courses, 6 weeks each, stories relating to the end of life. And we did that more than once. We went through the full series and said, these are good stories. Let's capture them in a book. So we wrote a book together called Stories of the Heart. And they're folk tales from around the world, not with any particular orientation other than saying they have something to do with end of life and in some cases loss. And we wanted to make them available to people, but for more than just storytellers. So we kind of include with each story some of the ideas of how you might understand these stories through exercises, not telling you what they mean, but what could you do to go deeper into the story. And these were things we learned to do in our classes. So yeah, it's been out now almost exactly a year, and it's doing well. I'm pleased with it, and I'm always surprised at somebody who's picked it up and said, "Oh, I heard this, I found this book and I read this story in it, and it really helped me." And I had no idea that they would ever read the story in the way that they did. So that's a treat.
Well, yes, it's very fascinating because as you've just said, whenever we hear a story and we listen to a story, we actually think of something that resonates with
Hmm.
us of that story, and there are so many different views of the same story. It's fascinating what you work with stories relating to death and these transformational passages of life. And this actually, Despina, correct me if I'm wrong, but we spoke to David Thompson, a storyteller from Texas. You may know him, Jim.
I do,
And
yes.
he too told us a story about relating to death. Am I right, Despina? It was David. Am I
Yes,
getting
yes.
confused?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, it was just brilliant how the story resonated with us both, I think, Despina, but in different ways, because it
Mm.
was the anniversary of your mom's death. I was going through another difficult period, and it was brilliant. We listened to the story with an open heart, an open mind,
Hmm.
and at least for me, I kept thinking about the story for the whole evening
Hmm.
afterwards.
I have
Hmm.
experience of my own on that, Simona, because I have attended one of Jim's workshops. Only one, I'm ashamed to admit, through a story round, I think it was. It was this summer, and it had to deal with grief and mourning. So this summer, I was working as a night shift receptionist, which meant that I could do American evening time. So that was lucky. I watched Jim do his magic, if I may put it that way, because he took one story from this particular book, the one with stories from the heart he was talking about earlier, and went so deep inside the story, layer after layer after layer. I think everybody followed. And when we were put in Zoom rooms where we had to share, it was like you were talking with people you didn't know and whom you might never see again. And it was, I don't know, therapeutic is to say the least. I think it was healing.
Hmm.
So,
Yes. Oh, I'm glad. And that's what, I think those layers are always there. It takes a little bit of skill to help open them up. But I think that's something we do naturally. We just need a little guidance going through it. And one of the challenges as a storyteller who wants to do this kind of work is to, as I said before, to make it possible for people to hear in the stories what they need to hear, even though you have no idea what that is. So it's a wonderful experience and challenge.
So maybe if we asked for a story now, Jim, would you like to share one
A
with us?
story. What do I know about stories? Oh dear. Well, let's see. The Kalahari say, tell the story that's pursuing you. That's the one you should be telling. And there are two right now that are fighting. uh, Maybe I'll tell the tear jar. I think that's the one that's going to win right now. It happens to come from the Jewish tradition. I don't think there's a lot in it that makes it specifically Jewish, but it happens in a Jewish context. And so there was this community, and this community was suffering from a drought. And the drought had gone on for a very long time. The crops were not flourishing, the animals were thin, the grass was dry, the ground was hard. It was a very difficult time. And people didn't know what to do. So they went to their rabbi and they said, Rabbi, we need rain. What can you do? What do we need to do to get rain? And the rabbi said, well, there's a prayer. And because this is such a difficult drought, everybody should go home and say this prayer tonight. And then tomorrow it'll rain. And they thanked him and they all went to their homes and they said the prayer. And if anything, the next day was hotter and drier than ever before. Didn't work. So they went back to the rabbi and they said, it didn't work. You can see it didn't work. What do we do? And the rabbi said, sometimes to give a prayer extra power, we have to fast before we say the prayer. So this time, everybody fast for a day and then say the prayer, and then it'll surely work. So people went home and they fasted and they prayed, and nothing happened. Again, it just got worse. Now, people weren't just upset, they were scared, they were thirsty, they were hungry. And they came back to the rabbi and they said, you've got to do something. We're not going to make it. And the rabbi said, what we need to do is not only say the prayer and not only fast, but we need to say the prayer in community. So everybody go home and fast, and then tomorrow evening, we'll all gather in the synagogue and we'll say the prayer together, and surely that will bring the rain. So people went home and they fasted and they came into the synagogue and everybody was there. And the rabbi was up towards the front. And he said to the caretaker, is everyone here? The caretaker, who knew these sorts of things, looked around and he said, well, we seem to be missing someone, but I'm not sure who it is. So the rabbi called out to the congregation and said, who's missing? Who's not here? And this murmur goes through until finally somebody says, oh, I know. It's the widow, Chava, the one who lives off by the edge of town. She's not here. So the rabbi says to the caretaker, go get Chava. We'll wait for her to get here. We need everyone here for this to work. The caretaker runs off, and time goes by, and finally, he arrives with Chava. And she comes into the synagogue carrying a jar, a tear jar, made of pottery. She walks up to the front of the congregation and she raises her tear jar and she says, "My husband died years ago. And after that initial mourning period, I never saw any of you again. I sat in my cottage and I wept, and no one was there to comfort me. And in fact, I collected all the tears that I cried in this jar. And if your God is not compassionate enough to give you rain, well, then the only rain you're going to get is from me smashing this tear jar on the ground." And in that moment, they heard thunder, and the rain came. And the congregation started dancing and singing. They were so full of joy that finally the drought was lifted, that no one saw her leave. She slipped out of the congregation. And the next morning, when people finally left, they looked out, and there in the yard of the synagogue was a pomegranate tree. And around the base of the tree were the smashed shards of that tear jar. And the pomegranate tree had grown up from that water. And we're told that the pomegranate, its fruits look like tears. And there are the same number of seeds in that pomegranate as there are ways of fulfilling the rules of the world.
Thank you so much for that, Jim. Wow, now I need to reflect on that.
But I've got a question.
Please.
What about the widow? Where does the widow end up? We don't know.
We don't know. So
What do
many
you
questions.
think, Jim?
I have several different endings that I imagine. I'll share one with you. I was sharing this with the community, and one of the questions that came back was, at first, I really didn't like. They said, "Well, wasn't it her fault that she separated herself from the community? And so she brought on the drought." And what rolled up in me is, there you go again, blaming the victim, you know?
Yeah.
And then I thought, wait a minute, it is a community. And she's not the center of the blame, but she's also part of it, right? The community was in a drought. And so did she rejoin the community then? What did she do to work her way back in? Not only what did they do to welcome her back in, but what was her role and her responsibility in that, which is not to shift the burden that a community has to each of its members. But that's why one of the reasons I love this story is it's so full of difficult questions.
I had only in my mind that she left her fruit behind.
Mm-hmm.
So she was there in another sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also I thought of this tradition, this Western tradition of smashing a pomegranate on the threshold of the house at New Year's for good luck. So it's like the smashing of the pottery.
Mm-hmm.
It resembles it.
Yes. Well, and the pomegranate is such a rich symbol. I mean, it's a symbol of fertility. It's a symbol of sweetness and sourness at the same time. I mean, it's just, I love to tell stories with pomegranates in it.
Well, it is the essential part of one of my favorite myths between Persephone and Hades.
Oh, yes,
And
yes.
my
Right.
daughter's name is Persephone.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I think how the way people use this, the oak tree or the sacred oak tree, or if it's not the pomegranate, it would be some other magical seed, apple, for example. We have loads of stories and lots of different traditions with apples being the, it's a sideways character, but it does make things move.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And people were always connected with the land and its fruits and, the things that we
Yes.
use for survival. But yeah, it must mean different things to different people because we look at things through our own personal
Hmm.
glass always.
Hmm.
And this is why
Always.
it's very interesting. It's highly recommended for people to attend workshops with Jim Brule if you find them, because you do get work done.
Thank you.
Simona, do you have a question for Jim?
I'm still reflecting on the story, and since we were talking about it, I was thinking. So you said this is a Jewish story, so it comes in the culture of the Mediterranean Sea, after
Hmm.
all. And there are so many myths, for example, Greek myths,
Hmm.
well, of course, related to Roman mythology and so on around the Mediterranean, where there are people transforming into trees for
Hmm.
various reasons. And one thing that I thought, when you were telling the story, I thought, oh, she transformed into the tree. But then you didn't specifically say that. And so I thought, oh, but where's the widow? And in my mind, she is the tree, and she gave herself to the community as a tree, as a pomegranate tree. So my question for you is, could it be that being part of this kind of stories of the Mediterranean area, she
Hmm.
herself
Hmm.
transformed into the tree?
A great question. And I want to answer it in two ways. When I look at a story and trying to understand it for myself, one of the things that to me is at the center of that work is to imagine differences in how that story might be told. Not to say that I'll find the correct one, right? But I want to see it from as many different angles as possible. And only then will the meaning that makes the most sense to me start to emerge. In this case, what you've just suggested is, well, maybe there's a different ending here. What happens if we shift that from her disappearing, you know, staying human and going somewhere else and turning into the tree? So, as if I were to look at that then in this model, I would say, well, what's lost and what's gained in the story with that change? What's gained is that she stays in the community in a visible way that is nurturing to the community. It's a very beautiful ending. And that's a gift. What's lost is the whole question of social responsibility. And the other question that sits in the back of this story is, was God responsible for the drought? And if so, why did God send the rain when the people hadn't repented of their sin? So that ending removes that question. It says, she's still there, everything is okay. So I would be less inclined to want that ending, but I would learn from it. I would learn from it. Wait a minute, there is a gift that she brought that persists beyond the anger that she showed and that really turned into a nourishing gift. So, yeah, it's possible.
Very interesting, yes.
Sorry, I'm a bit lost in thought.
That happens.
I think it's supposed to happen.
Yes, yes.
Okay, but you know what, Jim? We do need time to digest this one and the rules of the world. But you did say there were two stories persecuting you. Just so you know, just in case it interests you, we have time enough for the second one to
Okay,
come out.
I'd love to. I'll tell a shorter version of it because this is a story that can go on. And this is a story, I have to think. This is a story within a story. So there once was a king who was a widower. He had lost his wife. He only had one child, and that was his daughter. And the two of them were very close. And the thing that they loved to do the most was for him to tell her stories. She would sit in his lap and he would tell her stories, and their love just flowed between them. And there was one story that they loved to tell the most. And that was a story about these two young children who were twins, a boy and a girl. And they were so close that they had a shofar, which is a ram's horn. Each one of them had a shofar taken from the same ram. And these two shofars were so in tune with each other that if you blew on one, the other would vibrate. No matter how far apart they were, one would vibrate. And they would play hide and seek. They would go off into the fields and into the forest, and they would try and lose each other and then find each other by blowing the horns and feeling them vibrate until they got back together. And this was their favorite story, the two twins with twin shofars. Now, the second thing that this father and daughter loved to do was take long rides into the forest. And the king would just take one man to drive the carriage, and it would be the two of them, and they would do their best to go off into the forest in a way they'd never gone before, and they would go for hours. Well, one day they were doing that, and it was getting close to evening, and they were thinking it was time to come home when a terrible thing happened. A snake reared up. It frightened the horse. The carriage overturned. The guard was killed. The king was flung from the carriage and hit his head and was unconscious. And the daughter was thrown in the other direction down a ravine, tumbling, her clothes tearing. She got all muddy till she landed at the bottom. Well, remember, this is towards nighttime, and they've not told anyone where they're going. At the castle, they keep waiting for the king to return, and he doesn't return. So it isn't for many hours later that they actually find him. This took that long in the night. And he was so badly injured, they said, well, we have to get him back to the castle. They couldn't find the daughter, the princess. So they said, we'll look for her in the morning. In the meantime, there was a band of thieves who were moving through the ravine, and they heard the terrible commotion. And they saw this young woman tumbling down the side of the ravine. She was obviously also very injured, and she hit her head. So they gathered her up and they took her back to their camp and they tended to her. But they were thieves and they had to keep on the move to make their living. So they took her with them. So that when the guards came back, there was no trace of her whatsoever. The king was terribly, he was devastated. And he sent people out looking for his daughter, but she wasn't to be found. In the meantime, the thieves nursed her back to health. And when she finally was physically sound, she realized she didn't know who she was or what her story was. She was a blank slate. The only thing she knew was she loved to tell stories. Well, they kind of adopted her and they took her from place to place. And it turned out to be their advantage because she was such a good storyteller that she could distract everybody in the market while they went out and picked pockets and did their little thievery. So she got to tell stories. They got to keep themselves fed. The king, on the other hand, was getting worse and worse. I mean, he'd lost his daughter, his last remaining blood relative, and he sank into a deep depression. Well, this went on for weeks and weeks and months until his court said, we've got to do something. Nothing seems to help him. The only thing we can think to do is he loves stories. Let's have a storytelling festival and bring people from around the nation. And so they came. And of course, the princess, who didn't know she was the princess, had heard about this, and everybody said, oh, you should go. You're such a great storyteller. And she got up to the stage to tell her story. She stepped out on stage and she forgot every story she knew. Well, they pulled her off the stage. And the second day of the festival, she insisted on trying again. They put her at the end of the line, and finally she gets up to tell her story. Nothing. The third and the final day of the festival comes, and she forces her way up on the stage. They don't want to let her up there. And this one story bursts out from her. There were once two twins who had a pair of shofars from the same ram. And as soon as the king heard the opening of the story, he stood up and started to walk towards her. And the closer he got, the more he recognized her, the more she recognized him. Until finally they fell into each other's arms and they were restored. Now I want to tell you a story about the story. I told this story once. One of the first times I told it was to my synagogue. And it was told for one of the holidays. And my daughter, who was living overseas at the time, had just had their first child. And she wasn't going to be able to make it home in time for the holiday. She was going to come a day later because of where she was. But I decided I'll tell this story because, it'll be my gift to her in spirit, the father and daughter being reunited. And just before I started the story, she walked in. And I fell apart. And the congregation, it's a small congregation, they know me, they fell apart. It was just this amazing moment of this. And so now I'm telling the story, I'm getting through it somehow, weeping all the time. And after the service was over, one of the congregants came up to me and he said, I want to thank you for this story. It was such a beautiful story. It touched me deeply. I said, thank you. Glad to hear that. He said, yes. He said, I lost my daughter 7 years ago. And I said, oh, I can't imagine, especially not in this moment, losing my daughter. That must hurt. I'm so sorry. He said, oh, no. She didn't die. We had an argument and we stopped talking to each other. She lives down the street from me. And now I'm going to go talk to her. So you never know.
I hope they made up.
I do too. I think they did.
It was a very comforting story to hear.
Yes.
Are you wiping tears, Simona Lo?
Yeah, sorry, I'm terrible with this kind of things.
You're
With crying.
wonderful.
You are. My
Go
best
ahead.
friend once watched one of your storytelling events online. She was just sitting beside me, and it was another story you told that involved a river of tears.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I vaguely remember it now. I remember the feeling it left me, and I remember my best friend crying her eyes out at my side. Yeah, she was hugely moved.
Yeah.
Jim, I don't know if it's just me, but you've done this job for 15 years, you said, so you must know. Have you ever had people come to you and maybe cry at your sessions and then come to you and say thank you because I cried at
Yes,
your sessions?
yes, yes, yes.
So
Yeah,
liberating.
it can be. And that's part of what I look for. Sometimes it's that kind of release and liberation. Sometimes it's people wrestling with things that they didn't think they could wrestle with. I want to be able to open the door for them so they can choose how to go through it.
How does it feel to be you, knowing that you do so many amazing things for the people that you work with and that they feel this way?
It's very humbling, let me tell you, because, while I do know that I have skills and talents in this, they mostly come from learning how to listen with an open heart. That's where it mostly comes from. And it's being able to just invite people in and wait. I was seeing in my role as who I am, I'm a hospital chaplain, so I go in and I visit people in a variety of settings. And I went in to see a fellow a couple weeks ago. He was in his early 40s. He had just had double bypass surgery, which is very unusual at that age. He had a lot of medical problems. And basically, 3 days out of surgery, he was having a hard time speaking. It looked like it was exhausting to even try and answer a question. So I said, maybe I'll just sit with you for a while. And he nodded his head. And by the time the hour was over, I had learned an awful lot about him. And he had begun to speak without difficulty. And it was not the physical act of speaking that was a problem, but that he was in so much despair. And what he needed was not for me at that moment to tell him a story, but to just listen, to just listen. And even though that meant being silent for quite a while.
One thing that I noticed when you told stories now, but also when I listen to your stories on the internet, for example, on YouTube, is that you pause during the
Hmm.
stories, and that confers a kind of a gravity to the story. Is that something that you do naturally, or because of the kind of stories that you're telling, of the weight of the stories that you're telling? Or sometimes storyteller just want to tell their stories, they're excited about telling
Yes,
their
yes,
stories. I know the feeling, so sometimes it's hard to pause, but it's also very important to pause and
yes,
relax and
yes.
tell the story calmly. What is your point of view?
Well, it's something I learned. So it didn't start out naturally for me. In that first career as a family therapist, one of the techniques I was taught and used was clinical hypnosis. And one of the tools of hypnosis is to be silent for a while and to make room for people to find their own meaning and understanding. And so when I went back and studied this kind of storytelling, that was also part of it. So it was a tool I was taught. I think I do it now much more intuitively, but I know that that's going to be the way I pace a story. I I don't want to say I carefully plan where the pauses will be, but I know they're coming and I pretty much know where they'll be. I like to tell my students who are learning to insert pauses to stop at a certain point and pause. And they say, how long? And I say, until you feel uncomfortable, and then pause a little while longer. And that builds the muscle to learn how to pause. But yes, so that is definitely one of my styles, one of my techniques. It's something I learned, but I've incorporated it into the way I do things naturally now. Yeah.
Now I have a story to tell, so.
Ah, good.
It had been a while since I last heard a story and it stuck with me. there's this lumberjack up on the mountain who's really good at his job. He's very productive. He's got a lot of disciples, workers who are learning by his side. At one point, a youngster is brought to him to become his disciple. And that one is big and he's muscular and he's loud. And he looks down at the master. And he says, I don't even understand why my parents brought me here. There's nothing I can learn from you. Obviously, I'm much stronger than you. What could you possibly teach me? The lumberjack goes, all right then, let's have a competition. Let's start cutting wood from dawn until dusk, or until one of us cannot take it any longer and wants to stop, and see who does best. Sure, let's do that, says the youngster. So next morning they start chopping wood, and every now and then the master lumberjack, he takes a break and goes, sits under a tree and just plays with his knife. And the young man looks at him and he says, he's old, he needs his pauses, he cannot take it, this is too hard for him. But I won't feel sorry for him, I'll just keep at it and I'll beat him and he'll see. So he keeps chopping wood. A little while later, after they have both been working, the master lumberjack takes a break, goes and sits under a tree, has a little snack, takes his time, and then carries on his work. So at the end of the day, they have to compare their piles of wood. And I kid you not, the master lumberjack's pile is obviously taller and bigger than the young man's. That's impossible, you have cheated, says the youngster. I have been cutting wood all day while you have been taking breaks as the old man that you are, and still you have more wood than I? No, I'm sure you had some hidden somewhere and just brought it here just to spite me. Young man, I don't need to do that. There is something very important you fail to grasp. While you were cutting wood all day and I was sitting at the shadow of that tree resting, I was sharpening the axe. When I started working again, I was working with a fresh axe. But you have been working non-stop all day, so your axe is blunt. You see now? Well, suffice to say that he did become one of his best disciples, and he did learn a lot after all.
Very nice.
It has to do with the pauses one must take in so many different aspects of life, stories being just one of them.
Yes.
We need to catch our breath and sharpen our tools.
I agree. I want to say one more thing about the pause, though, because I loved your story. And this is just another reason for the technique. One is to sharpen, and if I were going to use that as a metaphor, we're allowing the audience to sharpen their blade when we pause, and listen better or more deeply. There's another reason, and they're both important. If I'm telling you a story about a farm, and I tell you that there's a fence with some barbed wire on it. If I say to you, this barbed wire was really exquisitely produced. Each barb was tied in this particular way. There were so many inches apart. I give you a lot of detail about that barbed wire fence. Then the only barbed wire fence you can see is mine, because I've painted it in such detail. If I say there was an unusual barbed wire fence, and that's all I say, then you see the fence you need to see. If I say nothing about the fence, then I don't introduce that to you at all, and you've missed it. So part of the pause is to allow those moments to occur where the people see what they need to see or feel what they need to feel in the story without you telling them. The challenge then becomes, how do you continue the story knowing they've just populated it with things you don't know and will never know? And that's the joy of this kind of storytelling.
There is this kind of rule, let us say, in Greek folklore, not the ancient myths, the more modern fairy tales, still they're old, where you don't get to describe beauty, for example. If there is a main character, a princess or somebody who is to fall in love and go through stages, etc., later on, you just say she was the beautiful of the world. And then everybody can make up their own beauty in their minds.
Yes.
No need to talk about hair, eyes, no need to talk about anything.
Same idea. Same idea. Very good.
Jimmy, it was brilliant. Yeah, it was brilliant. It was my first time meeting you, and we talked for, I think, something like an hour, and it was as if I felt free speaking.
Time flew.
It was really, really nice.
Good, good. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad. It's a real pleasure. It really is.
Well, it's been really nice having you here, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday because you still have quite a few hours ahead of you.
Yes, yes, and I intend to. So thank you.
Enjoy. May you enjoy your day.
Enjoy. All right, you too.
Thank you, Jim.
Bye-bye.